Well, really, that's my conviction, and I hope you know that by now, that it is my absolute heart belief that it's as God's word is taught that transformation happens. It is by prayer. It is those two things together. It's the ministry of the word and prayer that the apostles were so committed to in the early church, and that's still where we are today. It's where my heart is. We need to be praying together, and we need to hear the word. I need to hear the word, and so that's why I'm glad to be preaching on this evening. These verses that I want to look at, I suppose it's particularly verse 19, I guess, that really came with such force to me at the beginning of the year, just the beginning of last week, New Year's Day. My pattern has been for some years to read through the Bible, the whole Bible in a year. I've done that lots of times, and of course when you do that, it does mean I've read every single verse in the Bible numerous times. But there are some times you come across a verse and you think, I don't ever remember reading that before. I don't know if you've ever had that experience. I sort of come across a verse. So I came across these verses in Isaiah 43, and I thought to myself, I don't remember them. But I think that's God bringing home to us certain verses at a certain time that are right for that moment. Now, I've written down 4 reasons why I want to talk about these verses tonight. Let me just lay them out for you. It really is verse 19 that first jumped out at me. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I'm making a way in the desert and streams in the wasteland. Well, of course, the first reason is it's quite a good New Year's verse, isn't it? I mean, this is the first Sunday of 2018. So this is an appropriate verse for a first Sunday of the year, I thought. That'd be good. I'm always on the lookout for something. When I'm not running through a series and we've got a special Sunday, I'm trying to be attentive and saying what's God saying to us, what verse would be appropriate. And this sort of leapt out for that reason. It's a verse about fresh starts, new beginnings. And I think it was Scott saying the other day, maybe in a prayer, sorry to wake you up there, I mean, New Year's just arbitrary. I mean, it's not really any different to a few days ago, is it? But we mark it as something different. So there's something psychological about that. We're saying this is a fresh start for us. So it's an appropriate verse for that. I don't know if you've made any New Year's resolutions. I've made a few, and I am not telling you them for good reason. So that's one reason. It's a good verse at the beginning of the year. Secondly, this is actually a time of new things for Mick and Jill. And so I wanted it to sort of be, I was thinking about thankfulness, preaching on thankfulness. That's a good theme, and that would be appropriate and right. But then I thought, actually, it's new for you two, isn't it? Because I presume you haven't been retired before. No, not secretly.
I'm retired just after leaving school after that.
He retired after leaving school, apparently. So there we go. So this is new. This is new for Mick and Jill. So I thought, well, this is good. We can think about new things for their sake as well. And that seems appropriate. Then thirdly, of course, it's a new time for us as a church. I guess that's where it hit me first. It's a new time for us as a family, for the Lintott family, as we move into this church family here, which we are really grateful to God for. We really are grateful to God for you already, and feel that bond of love being knit just in the few months we've been here. But it's new for us now, as part of that, for us as a church family. Things are just going to be slightly different. So just thinking about what God says about new things, I thought, well, that'll be quite appropriate. Maybe we can look into that. And as I was reading through it last week and then this week in preparation, it really seemed very much as if God was saying, this is a verse, you need to just take hold of this. In a similar way to the Zechariah verse. In a similar way, this felt like God saying, look, just have a think about this. Just think this through. But then there's a fourth reason. When I started doing my work, my preparation work, looking at the text and working through Isaiah 43 during the week, it became very quickly apparent that this section is all about something that we've been looking at for the last few months. This section is actually all about the Exodus. Now, I hadn't expected that. The Exodus story, this is Moses leading the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, through the Red Sea, into the Promised Land, eventually through the wilderness. Well, this is what this is about, this passage. And I thought, well, hey, that's a real gift. It gives us an opportunity to see how that great account from 1300 BC is unfolded in Isaiah's day in 700 BC. How does he think about that? More importantly, what does God think about the Exodus in Isaiah 43? Now, there are probably other great reasons to be looking at this passage, but 4 was quite enough. I normally only work on 1, but that was 4 reasons I thought that's a really good passage for us to be looking at tonight. So that's what we're doing. So tonight we begin 2018 with these 4 verses. And what I want to try and do is explain to you what's happening, and then I want us to feel the encouragement of what God's saying here to his people in Isaiah 43. 3 points. First one is this, very simply, learn from history. God says, learn from history. Verse 16, this is what the Lord says, he who made a way through the sea, a path through the mighty waters, who drew out the chariots and horses, the army and reinforcements together, and they lay there, never to rise again, extinguished, snuffed out like a wick. Now, just to set the context a little bit about who's speaking and who he's speaking to, this is Isaiah. He was a prophet living in Old Testament times, pre-Jesus. He was sent by God to speak to God's people, Judah, as they were surrounded by some pretty terrifying enemies. It was a time of massive change as empire after empire arose and then fell. And caught right in the middle of all those mighty empires that were rising up and going down were God's people in the promised land. I was trying to think of a way how I might try and explain that to you this evening simply, in a manageable way, and I came up with this. I don't know if this is going to work. This is the first time I've ever tried this, so you can tell me at the end whether this worked or not. I want you to imagine that you're back at school. Okay, for some of us that's going to take more imagination than others, but imagine that you're back at school, okay? And you're in a massive school. I don't know, there's 2,000 people in this school. It's absolutely huge. We're not talking village school, we're talking big, big school. And in this massive school, you've got a group of friends. Just a tiny group of friends. You know, it's only 3 or 4 of you, but you are a group of friends. And that sort of feels okay, because you've got somebody there each day that you turn up to school with, that you know and you feel safe with. You've got this group of friends. But one day at this school, this huge, great lad, strapping great shot putter, turns up called Tig. And Tig is not a nice guy. You know, he's one of those lads at school you want to avoid if you possibly can. But the bad thing is that Tig notices your club, your group, your clan, your friends. And he wants a bit of the action. He wants to take over your group of friends. And this is a bit, what do you do with this? I mean, you can't fight him because he is about, you know how some year 11s are about 6'9", aren't they? I mean, how do they manage to do that? What are they feeding them on these days? But imagine this big lad, and you can't do anything about him. And so he's going to bring trouble to your group. And he starts taking your pocket money, you know, your dinner money, and starts making life pretty hard for you in every way that he possibly can. Now, at the school, this is where it gets slightly confusing. You've got another brother who's at the school as well. And he's got a group of friends. So there's you, sort of the junior brother, and then there's another brother who's got another group of friends, and Tig sees that group of friends too. And he decides he really doesn't like that group of friends at all. So what he wants to do is not take over that group, he wants to smash it up and spread it out all over the place. So he does. He breaks up your brother's group of friends and he spreads them everywhere. And they're all gone. And it's a pretty rough time for you. Just though before that happened, your brother came to you and said, look, I think we should make a sort of a super gang. You and me, and there's another friend I've got just along the way. And if we get together, we can beat this Tig. And you say, no, I'm not really interested in that. And you're rather glad, actually, that you said you're not interested, because it is absolute disaster for your brother and for his group and his other mates' group as well. Well, needless to say, things go on. Tig actually eventually gets beaten up and taken over by another lad who comes into the school. This time his name is Shal. So Shal beats up Tig, and he's now the sort of the big bully in the school, controlling things. And he makes things difficult for you as well. And then another bully comes along, takes over from him. His name's Sargon. And he takes over. I know they're funny names, but I had to pick something, didn't I? So you've had Tig, you've had, what's the other one? Shal, and then you've had Sargon. And then after him, there's a fourth one that comes along called Senna. Now, some of you are nodding, you know where I'm going with this. So he comes along, and this fourth one comes along, and really everything turns to rubbish, and it all really goes bad. And your brother and his mates, they've gone, their group's been smashed up, they're nowhere anymore, and you're just really left alone. And you've got these bullies in the school, and it's really hard work. Now, it sort of works that. It's a bit like what it was like to be in Judah, in Israel in those days. You've got Tiglath-Pileser, Tig, the first one, Shalmaneser, the second one. Have I just gone wrong with somebody there? Oh, Sargon, the second one. Shalmaneser, the third one. And then the last one, Sennacherib, the fourth one. These four great kings who rule empires, the Assyrian Empire, and they just take over the whole region. And it's very frightening because you're very small. You know, you're I was going to say a first year. What's the first year at school now? You're a year 7. That's very confusing to me. You're a first year at secondary school. You're very small. You've got these big bullies, can do a lot of damage, and you're thinking, what am I going to do? That's the situation that Israel and Judah are in here, that God's speaking into, to try and encourage them. And what's happened is Israel, the northern tribes, they've gone. Assyria have taken them off, and basically they've disappeared. They're not on the scene anymore. Your brother's gone. And this is what Isaiah's talking about. And he says, actually, there's something even worse coming. Another group called the Babylonians. And you're going to be in real trouble. You're going to be in trouble this time. He's living during the time of the first four bullies. He speaks about God's plans for his people in the future. And you can imagine that when you've seen bully after bully trashing your school, then you're going to be pretty down about the future. You're not going to have much hope about what's ahead. But God, through Isaiah, gives his people a history lesson from 600 years earlier. The last few decades have been bad. He knows that. But he says, think back 600 years. Verse 16, this is what the Lord says, he who made a way through the sea, a path through the mighty waters, who drew out the chariots and the horses, the army and the reinforcements together, and they lay there, never to rise again, extinguished, snuffed out like a wick. What's he talking about? Any ideas? Thank you, Red Sea. It's the Red Sea. Do you remember when Egyptian army came up behind Israel and they were trying to pursue them, and Israel are caught there between the Red Sea and the army, and they go through, God makes the way through. That's what he says here. And then the Egyptian army go in after them, and then they are snuffed out like a wick. What's the point? Well, God's saying something really wonderful. Don't think that your present situation is more difficult than what I had to cope with 600 years ago. Don't think it's more difficult. Do you not think that I can do something about this when I did that? You get the point? The point being, learn from history. Just read a bit of history. Think about what happened 600 years earlier. Think about what I did. Think about my power over the superpower of the day. It wasn't Assyria, it was Egypt. But look what I did to them. Look what I'm able to do. Don't think I can't deal with it. See, the temptation for God's people here was to think that things were too tough. That was then, but this is now. But God speaks and tells his people to learn from the past, to remember so that they can have confidence for the future. And of course that applies to us, doesn't it? One of the reasons the Bible is so full of narrative, that is story, historical events, description of events, is so that we can learn that the God who parted the Red Sea and the God who saved from Babylon is the same God who rescues and delivers today. He is no different. It is a nonsense to think that God is unable to act because he doesn't understand computers, he doesn't understand the modern age. Of course he understands it all. And he's well able to act. And he's not scared by Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin. None of these things are beyond him. He's still the same God who's able to act. And we can apply that at all sorts of levels. We can think about some of the challenging situations we're facing as families or individuals. Perhaps we're tempted to think that God is unable to deal with the complexities or the hugeness of the problem that I'm in today, at the moment. Perhaps you've got something coming up in 2018 that you're afraid of, something that's terrifying and making you feel very small. Well, here in Isaiah 43 is a massive word of encouragement to us. God says, look at the past, see what happened, see what I did, be encouraged. I am more than able for today to do the right thing. Now, for me, that's a great encouragement. I don't have to sort of whip myself into a frenzy thinking I can cope with 2018. I can say to myself, God is able. Whatever's ahead for 2018, he is well able. He's well able. So the first thing to see here is the call to learn from history. Second thing, point 2, don't get stuck in history. Learn from history, but don't get stuck in it. Here's verse 18. Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. Now, this is a hugely healthy and appropriate warning. It's easy to forget the past and not draw the comfort we should from it as we look at God's interventions in the past, but it's also true that living in the past can be hugely unhelpful. Do you see the balance there? We want to look at the past and see what God's done and say, you are amazing, you do amazing things, but I don't want to live in the past. I'm not in the past now. Now, let me suggest a couple of ways that we can do that, getting stuck in history, living in the past. It is possible to look back to the past and see all the problems of the past, and to live in the past in that way. You see, here it could be them thinking about the Assyrian kings of the past 20 years. If this is, as I suggested, the history time that this was written, which I think it is, then they've had decades of these bullies around them, these 4 successive Assyrian kings, doing lots of damage. And that over decades is going to beat in on your view of life. You're going to feel very downtrodden if that is what you've seen for so long. And so the potential is to be tempted to look back over those 2 decades or more, slightly more, and say, it's been a disaster. What will this future, this immediate future, how will this be different? I don't know if you've ever had this, where you've had an experience in the past that has so scarred you that it really paralyses you with fear when you think about the same thing today. Let me give you an example. How many of you have been bitten by a dog? That's quite a scary thing, isn't it? Particularly if it punctures. Now, I would be surprised if when you hear a dog barking, if that doesn't sort of just bring something back in your mind. Claire, when we were living in Hartlepool, got knocked over by a horse in a field, and the bruise was impressive. It was properly impressive, I have to say. But it did leave a mark, didn't it, emotionally, with horses. Now, what's true physically can be true spiritually. So we can have things that go on, defeats, failures, that so scar us that when it comes to the future, we think, uh-oh, this is going to be an absolute disaster. Do you understand where I'm going with that? We look at the past and we allow those failures or those problems to paralyse us for now, so we think, I don't know if I can cope. And so we come out in a cold sweat. We start shaking. You can think about the previous defeats. Satan, the enemy of our soul, he is effective. He's not completely done with, is he? He does a good job of bringing us down. And he can remind you about things in the past, so much so that you think, oh, I can't do any more. I think I'll leave it to the young people, or I think I'll leave it to somebody else, because, I'm not good. Well, here's a nugget of truth for you. Nor am I. Nor is anybody in the room. None of us serve because we're worthy to serve. We serve because of God's grace. That's why we serve. So living in the past, in the sense of living in our failures, can be very unhelpful. And to that, God says, just leave that well alone. Forget the past. If that's what's causing you to not serve and not getting engaged and involved, forget the past. Now, I have to confess that during the week I listened to 4 sermons on Isaiah 43. That's often how I prep. I prep in different ways, so I'll read, I'll do my text work, I'll do my outline, and then if I've got time I'll listen to some sermons just to see if there's anything that I've missed, anything that can sort of stimulate me. So this week I listened to 4 sermons on Isaiah 43, and I have to say, they weren't great. They just weren't great. And I say that humbly because, sometimes I preach some pretty stinkers. But, they weren't great sermons. And the thing that really I found most difficult with them was that none of them really wanted to deal with Isaiah. They wanted to just jump straight into, it's a new year, God's going to do something new, God bless you, go home and be encouraged. Oh, well, and that's all right, but it's not really what's going on here, is it? It's not really Isaiah. So I'm sort of listening to these. I've done a bit of work and I'm thinking, I wish somebody would engage the text. And then I listened to a sermon by a chap from America. He was obviously from a different type of church to ours because everybody was shouting out all the way through the sermon, Amen! And, they were full on. They were really going for it. And I thought, oh dear, this is going to be quite difficult to listen to. And I have to say, he had nothing to say about Isaiah. Of the four, it probably was the worst in that way. But strangely, I found myself massively encouraged by what he said. Because he started with this thought, that sometimes living in the past is about thinking about all those failures of the past year. So for us, thinking back to 2017, how do you think about 2017? Well, you might look back at it and you might think, well, there were some pretty rough things that went on in 2017, some things that I wished hadn't happened, some things I wished I could change, some failures, some difficulties. And then I thought very well, he encouraged people to see that God is well able to move you from all of those into something much more encouraging spiritually this year. And don't you want that? And that's what he really did. I'm not going to try and do it in his style, because his style is his style and not my style. I know, though, that desire to leave the past behind and see God's blessings going forward is very strong in me. I really want to know God's blessing in the most extraordinarily powerful and appropriate way in the year going forward. So I don't want to live in the past, in the failures of the past. So that's one way of thinking about the past in an unhelpful way. The second way is to live in the past and view it as all good. You can live in the past and think about all the failures, but you can also live in the past and think that everything was wonderful about the past. So you might think, I don't know, personally you might think, well, during my 20s as a Christian, it was the best decade. I learned so much, I was so on fire, and everything's gone a bit flat since then. That's sort of not helpful living in the past. I'll tell you a way that Christians in my sort of circles do it. They live in the past in terms of church history, the heroes of church history. Do you know what I mean by that? It was such a great time when so-and-so was alive. Certain heroes, the day of the Puritans, that was the great time for the church, or when God was really honoured or loved. Or perhaps, this is my least favourite, when the Doctor was alive. Now, some of you are probably thinking, Doctor Who? What? Why would Christians be obsessed with Doctor Who? Well, of course, they're not talking about Doctor Who. They're talking about Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. If you've not heard of him, don't worry about that. He was a great man used by God, a man greatly used by God. Certainly true. But some people think that everything about his ministry and that era was so good. What a disaster the church is today. I think that's an unhelpful living in the past, honestly, really. People do it with different heroes from the past, Wesley, the days of Wesley, or the days of Luther, or the days of Grimshaw, or my favourite, the days of Augustine. They were great days. Well, when they were alive, God did do amazing things. Yes, absolutely. But as Michael rightly said, it was God doing amazing things through very flawed people. I can look back with rose-tinted spectacles at Luther, Calvin, Augustine, etc., and think that we won't see those days again. And I just wonder if that's what's going on in these verses here. The people saying, the days of Moses, they were great days. These are rubbish days now. And God says to them, forget the past. I did great things, but don't live there. Now, that's a brief point, but it's a good warning. I don't want to live either crippled by the mistakes or sins of the past, or living in some sort of dream world about the past. I want 2018 to be a year when we see God do amazing things that will fill us with wonder, make our hearts rejoice at how great he is. Which brings me to the final point. Remember the past. Don't live in the past, but look at what God will do. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. Right, let's do the context work here then, and let's really understand what Isaiah is saying and get it right, hopefully. Firstly, this verse is not saying simply 2018 is going to be a better year than 2017. That is not what this verse is saying. These verses fit into the whole Bible story, the big picture. And in the big picture, God is talking about a second Exodus, a wonderful work that he's going to do with his people who are in captivity in Babylon. And he says, you're going to go into captivity, but I tell you what, I'm going to bring you out, and it's going to be wonderful. That's what he's talking about. I'm going to do something extraordinary, even better than the Exodus from Egypt. That's what he's saying to them. So in their context, in their situation, when they're feeling really depressed about all the things that are going on, and things are going to get worse for them, he's saying, don't worry, I'm going to do something new, something wonderful. But of course it doesn't stop there, because what God does when he prophesies things, he's always pointing forward, usually to one event in the very close future, but then nearly always to another event in the far future. So here we are, Isaiah, God speaking through Isaiah to his people and saying, don't worry, you're going to go into captivity, but I'm going to lead you out, and I'm going to do something wonderful, streams in the wilderness, in the desert. So that's something like BC, 700 BC, something like that. They're going to come out of captivity 500 and something BC. But then, another 700 years on from this prediction, God is going to do another Exodus, which is going to be amazing. So wonderful, so spectacular, so life-changing, so eternity-filling that it will make all the other previous Exoduses look like dress rehearsals, really. 700 years after Isaiah, God was going to send his son, the Lord Jesus, to come into the world to lead people not out of captivity to Babylon or Egypt, out of captivity to sin and Satan and death, and rescue them and breathe life where there was death. That's the Exodus that's being pointed to here. That's the new work that he's going to do, the new covenant that he's going to bring about. And that's what applies to us. That's how this verse comes to us. It's not just a vague promise that this year is going to be better than last year. That's not the promise here. What is the new thing that God's going to do? He's going to rescue the world. That's his plan. That is the plan that God has, to rescue the world. Now, I would say that's a pretty impressive plan. I know it's late, it's a warm room and, it's been a long day. But that is very exciting. God's going to rescue the world. And what he said is, that's my new work, that's what I'm going to do, and I want you to be involved in it and get on board and do it with me, partnering with me in this new work, this wonderful thing. So what happens going into 2018? What are we looking forward to? What is the new thing that God's going to do? Well, I'll tell you what he's going to do, what we're praying for, is he's going to save people. He's going to rescue people who were dead in their sins, spiritually dead, and he's going to make them come alive. He's going to lead a second Exodus and lead them out of darkness. And he said to us, you can be involved in that work too. And that's the work that you've got for 2018. So that's part of this wonderful work that he's called us to. And then he's also called us in 2018 to speak to each other as people who have had that new life breathed into us by grace, and encourage each other and build each other up in this new relationship with God. That's the new work, the great work that's going to go on. So we're going to pray together, we're going to speak together, we're going to work together, we're going to do great things over this next year together, because God is rescuing the world. That's the new thing. That's the great thing. Now, I'm really excited about that, because then it takes a little bit of the pressure off us being wonderful. That's a horrible pressure, isn't it? It's not about us being wonderful. It's about God being wonderful and doing an amazing work to rescue people from death. And he said, do you want something to do in 2018 that's amazing? Work with me in my new work.